All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Dave Varanchek, AKA A Rich Zip Code. So as I said earlier, it's an anagram of Zodiac Cipher. I'm a software developer. I build a lot of web applications. Sometimes I build crypto software. And my talk is, what is Zodiac's 340-character cipher? That's this thing. It's one of the world's most famous unsolved codes. I'd be surprised if there was anyone here who hasn't seen this before. Are there any? Have you all seen this cipher before?
Yes.
Okay. It was made almost 50 years ago by a serial killer in California. To date, no one's come up with a definitive solution for it, even though there have been a lot of proposed solutions. In fact, November of next year will be the 50th anniversary of when this was sent by the killer. About 11 years ago, I saw it for the first time on a website that was dedicated to the Zodiac Killer. And it got me really interested because I'm a programmer and I like puzzles, so I thought, hey, I can try applying my skills to see if I could crack it. And like many other programmers before me, failed miserably. But ever since, I've spent an unhealthy amount of time trying to figure this thing out, trying to learn more about it, and trying to crack it. And so what I want to do today is try to talk about the things that I've learned over those years. And since I've got a group of really smart code breakers, I'm hoping that'll spark some new ideas that we can apply to this problem. So who is Zodiac? Well, he's a serial killer who was active in Northern California in the late 60s and early 70s. He's definitively linked to attacks on 7 different people, resulting in the deaths of 5 of them. He may be connected to other unsolved cases, but no one knows who he is yet, so they don't have enough evidence to definitively link him to other crimes. There's some stuff in the news lately about DNA advancements, in particular the Golden State Killer, which was another long unsolved case, was recently apprehended because of advances in forensic genealogy. So they were able to take the DNA and do like family tree research and DNA matches to family members, and they were able to track them down. So there's some hope that they can do something like that for the Zodiac case as well. One thing that made the Zodiac Killer unique among serial killers was that he really liked to write letters and send them to newspapers in the area. And in the letters, he would brag about his crimes. He would include a lot of details about the crimes that only the police would know about, so it would authenticate him as the actual killer. He would threaten the public. He would talk about shooting up a school bus full of children to kind of scare people into doing what he wants. He would taunt the police for not being able to catch him. So the newspapers would publish these letters, and it created this like atmosphere of fear around this killer, that he was the boogeyman. He was lurking in San Francisco, and he was going to kill somebody at random. 4 of the letters he sent had ciphers in them. I'm referring to them by the lengths of the cipher texts. So the first cipher he sent was the 408. This is the only one that's been solved definitively out of the 4. The second one, which he sent 3 months after this one, is the 340. That's the famous unsolved one. And then there's 2 others, the 13 and the 32. I'm not going to talk about those because they're so short. There's really no way to verify a solution for them. There's not much hope that you could actually come up with a verifiable solution unless there's some like really strong connection to a previous cipher or some other clue. Maybe they've discovered a locker somewhere that has the key in it. That'd be nice. So we'll talk about the first cipher. The first cipher, what the killer did was he wrote 3 different letters, and with each letter he addressed 3 different newspapers. So each letter went to a different paper, and each had a third of this 408 character cipher. And the letter said, I'm the killer of the 2 couples a few months ago. And he had attacked these 2 teenage couples, and I think 3 of them died. Also in the letter he said, publish my cipher or else I'm going to go on a killing spree. I'm going to kill like a dozen people over the weekend if you don't publish my cipher in the next few days. So eventually the papers published all 3 parts of the ciphers. And within a week, like in less than a week, a high school teacher, Donald Harden, and his wife Betty managed to solve the cipher, pen and paper, just puzzling through it. I think they said they took them around 20 hours total to break the code, and they were able to break it. They figured out that it was a substitution cipher, a homophonic substitution cipher, because there's so many symbols. And they ended up with this plain text that starts with, I like killing people because it's so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. And it keeps going on. It's basically him talking about why he's killing. It's like a mission statement of sorts. The end of the cipher, these last 18 symbols, using the key that they discovered, doesn't decode to anything coherent. It decodes to gibberish. And there's some theories about that. It could be that he was adding filler material down here just to make the parts equal size, right? Another theory is, in one of the letters that he sent with these ciphers. He said, "In the cipher is my identity." So of course people think, well, maybe you can take these last 18 and try to work it to find a name. So people tried to do anagrams and all kinds of games with the last 18 to figure out maybe there's a name in there. Those have been pretty fruitless so far. So here's the key that they discovered. It's a homophonic substitution. So the plain text letters that are most frequent in English have multiple symbol assignments, and that disguises the frequency of the underlying plain text letters. So it makes it harder to solve. You can't just do frequency analysis and guess what the letter substitutions are. You have to be a little smarter than that. There's a little bit of ACA history connected to the case. In the end of 1969, the Cryptogram published a copy of the 408, the first cipher, and the article about how it was solved and the connection to the crimes. And then the beginning of 1970, after the second cipher was published in the papers, the Cryptogram published a reproduction of it. And then sometime later, ACA member Mumbles got a clearer copy of the original cipher, and he was able to make corrections to some of the symbols that were transcribed in the copy that was in the original Cryptogram article. So it's always made me curious, well, in the amount of time that it's been in the Cryptogram, what ideas did ACA members try out? What did they come up with? So I'd be interested to learn more about that. This is Robert Graysmith. In 1986, he published a book that he wrote about the case, and it became a bestseller. It brought a lot of attention to the case, became more widely known. And in the book, he claimed to solve the 340, the second unsolved cipher. He also claims that 2 ACA members endorsed his solution. He's saying the American Cryptogram Association said, my solution is right. He said Greg Mellon, who is, I think his name was Codex, he was a co-founder of Cryptologia. He said that Greg Mellon called him up and said, congratulations, you broke the code. Seems pretty definitive. He also says Eugene Waltz, I think his name was Dancer, that he joined Greg Mellon in endorsing the solution. So he said, your solution is good and valid. You are to be congratulated for breaking the cipher. So why are we here 50 years later, talking about this code if Graysmith solved it and the ACA endorsed the solution? Well, if you look at the solution that's in his book, it's nonsense. He took the 340, he came up with a substitution for it. It decodes it to gibberish. The plain text is gibberish, right? But then he went on each line and he rearranged letters arbitrarily to make words come out until he was satisfied with the words. And it made this kind of non-grammatical pile of letters that he had to justify each word, saying, well, it's connected to the case because of this, it's connected to the case because of that. And it's this incoherent mess. But he says the ACA endorsed it. Was he lying? Did they really endorse it? There's no other evidence that they have. I can find no evidence that they actually did endorse it. And Graysmith was known to be loose with the facts on other aspects of the case that he was talking about in the book. So I have a lot of doubt that this is true. Another way the ACA was connected to it was the president of the ACA at the time, DCB Marsh. He actually had been in the articles about the hardened solution for the 408, saying that he confirmed the hardened solution. That if you apply the substitution key that they came up with, you do get the message that they say is in the 408. It's pretty self-evident when you apply the key. But DCB Marsh was mentioned in a lot of those articles. Well, at some point after more crimes were committed, there was an effort by people to try to lure the killer into turning himself in, either intentionally or unintentionally. And one of the ways they did that was, there was an article about DCB Marsh where he was talking about daring the Zodiac to put his name in another cipher and mail it to him. Like, make it as complicated as you want, just send it to me, I'll take a look at it. He even included an address, which I hope was not his home address.
Post office or something.
Yeah. Hopefully it's like a police station or something, I don't know. And they would get a letter, and I guess they could do some forensics on the letter and maybe crack the code and maybe get more, maybe that would have helped catch the guy. So I'm wondering, did they actually get anything? Did anybody actually mail anything to that address? And another thing that happened was there was an article about the Zodiac in one of the papers, and off to the side was this message to the Zodiac here, written in Cipher. And that's attributed to DCB Marsh, that he came up with this code. And turns out he not only used symbols that the Zodiac used from the first cipher, but he used the same key. So if you apply the key to that, you get a plain text that says something like call, or Zodiac, call Libra 433, and some numbers spelled out, and it's a phone number. So presumably they were trying to lure him into calling this phone number so they could trace the call and figure out where he was calling from and then catch him, right? So I'm wondering if anyone actually was able to figure that out at the time, because this was in late 1969 or early 70s when this was in the papers. Back to the question at hand, what is the 340? We can start by comparing it to the 408. We know that Zodiac at least was capable of making a real cipher. The 408 is a real substitution cipher. It works. So he has enough technical know-how to do that, to build one. So the 340 has some similarities to it. He uses the similar symbols. He writes it out neatly in this grid layout. Pretty meticulous, drawing of the symbols. This is a reproduction, but it's, the originals are pretty organized. Both ciphers are written in a grid that's 17 symbols wide. So he writes the same number of symbols across in each one. The 340 is a little shorter, so it only has 20 rows. 408's got 24 rows. 408 was sent in 3 parts. 340 was sent as one whole cipher. It wasn't split up. But it kind of has these things, these dashes, kind of marking the midway point. So people have been speculating, is there some significance to that? We take a closer look at the alphabets used. In both ciphers, he used a mix of uppercase letters and mirrored versions, they reversed versions and flipped versions, some punctuation and symbols, variations of circles, triangles, and squares. Interestingly, he didn't use the normal C in the 408. You won't find a normal C anywhere in it, but you will find a backwards C. So why would he bother making a ciphertext? I mean, he could have used a C. Why did he decide to use a backwards C? The best explanation I've heard for this is if you have a key ahead of time, before you encode your ciphertext, before you encode your plaintext, you may have the C assigned to a plaintext letter that you didn't end up using in your plaintext. And as it turns out, there's 3 letters in the plaintext that aren't used, J, Q, and Z, the least used letters in English, right? So he probably had a C next to that on his key, and it just never got used. So the same thing's happening in the 340's alphabet. There's no Q, there's no forward Q. There is a backwards Q though. So that suggests, well, the plaintext of the 340 might be lacking one of those low frequency English letters. It's not much to go on, but it's something. Here's another version of that comparison, but with the differences highlighted. So the blue symbols here in the 408, they're in the 408, but they're not in the 340. And then these are the symbols that are in the 340, but aren't in the 408. And you can see he added more of these shapes, the variations of the circles and square, some more lines. And for some reason, he didn't like these eyes, so he replaced them with these fancier ones. Who knows why?
So you can tell whether they're reversed.
That's true. So the fact that there's 54 symbols in the 408 versus 63 in the 340 was one of the reasons why the 340 is a little harder to solve, because it has a longer key, bigger search space, makes it harder to come up with a solution. So like any good cryptanalyst should do, they should make a frequency analysis of the symbols. So because it's homophonic, the symbols tend to be spread out and flattened. So you can't really look at this and conclude what letters any particular symbol stand for. In fact, if you were to look at the most frequent symbol that occurs in the 408, you would see a backwards Q, which turns out to stand for plaintext M, which is like the 14th most frequent letter in English. So you can't solve the code just by looking at the frequency analysis. 340 has a similar flatness to the symbol distribution, except for the plus sign. For some reason, the plus sign is twice as frequently occurring as the second most frequent symbol, this B. So from here on, it's pretty normal, what you would expect for homophonic. But for some reason, there's all these pluses everywhere. There's what they look like in the ciphertext. They're very uniformly distributed through the ciphertext. Why are they there? Does it stand for one letter? Some people have speculated it might be a wild card. That's why there's so many of them. or there's some relation to some part of the scheme that he did when he made this. It has some other meaning that we haven't discovered yet. So since we can't rely on the frequency of unigrams, single symbols, let's look at larger patterns, bigrams, pairs of symbols. Here's an example of a repeating bigram that appears in the 408, the solved cipher. This square and the B repeats 6 times. As it turns out, the square and the B they both stand for the letter L. And it's because words with LL in them happen a lot in his plain text, like the word kill, the word killed, the word killing, things that he liked to talk about. So those patterns from the plain text are still coming through, even though the homophonic encoding is hiding the single character frequencies, right?
That says something about his mind too, that he didn't reverse them and make it a B square.
That's what I was just thinking. Why didn't he reverse them? Why is it always square B instead of B square? It would kind of make it even more diffused.
Yeah, and there's other problems too. Like if you look, there's doubles. These half-filled squares.
Right. Yeah.
And then these two.
Then you have a double R further up.
Double R and about the 10th line down, far right.
There's a double, there's a double R. I forget what that stands for. But these, in the stories that the Hardens told about solving the code, it said that they solved it. They tried to do frequency analysis, but they looked at these patterns and they saw the doubles and they reasoned that, well, what's the most common double in English? It's LL. So they plugged it in and they reasoned, well, he talked about killing, right? So they would plug in, KILL. And as it turns out, it appears up here, I like killing. And, they were able to crib certain areas of it. And then by trial and error, they were able to come up with a solution, right? And this was discussed a lot in the papers, how they actually solved it. And they talked about patterns. So by the time Zodiac came up with his second code, you could reason that he saw that in the papers and went, well, why didn't I, use different symbols to hide those patterns, right?
For letters I know I like to use.
Right. So this diagram on the right, this just shows all of the repeating bigrams. So you can see there's a lot of repeating patterns in the underlying plain text that are peeking through into the ciphertext that aren't hidden by the encryption. And this amount of repeating bigrams is very statistically significant compared to random shuffles of the ciphertext. So it's not by random chance that all these patterns will be coming out. It's because the plain text has a lot of redundancies. It has all these repeating bigrams, TH, LL, AN. We can do the same test for the 340 to find the repeating patterns. Maybe it's a reflection of the underlying plain text. The 408 has 62 of the repeats in the known solved cipher, but the 340 only has 25. So it seems like it has some, but not nearly as many. They don't cover as much of the ciphertext, and there's this big area where there are very few whatsoever. And if you do a statistical test, you find that on average you would find about 20 repeating bigrams in random shuffles of the cipher. So this isn't far from the average. This is 25. 1 in 10 of the shuffles will have that many repeating bigrams in them. So did he do something to hide the bigrams? Is there some kind of transposition going on? The bigrams are somewhere else?
He's smarter about his plain text.
He's smarter about his plain text. As it turns out, there's ways to get more bigrams to come out if you do different operations on the ciphertext. Here's one such operation. It's a very simple transposition rule called period 19. Basically, you just start at the top first symbol and write it down. And then you skip ahead 19 positions, and then you land on this symbol, and then you write it down. Do it again, write that symbol down, keep going until you get to the bottom. Right?
Did you hit on 19 again? Sorry, I think I must have not caught that.
Say again?
The 19? How did
You count ahead 19 positions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 19.
Where does 19 come from?
Why 19?
Yeah, that's what
I'll show you.
Oh, okay.
I'll show you.
Maybe I just didn't. It's early in the morning and I don't
'Cause-
catch on fast in the morning.
Because the other ones don't work as well. 19 happens to be the one that works pretty well.
Oh, okay.
That's the interesting part. Okay, so you get to the bottom, then you jump back to the top, start writing these down, start from the second symbol, do the same rule, and then keep doing this. Eventually visiting all the symbols, and you end up with this transposed ciphertext. And then you can test for the repeating bigrams.
Oh, I see.
And then it jumps from 25 in the original to 37 at period 19. That's like a almost 50% increase in the number of repeating bigrams.
Okay,
So-
now I get it. Now I get it.
And you tried the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way to 19?
Yes, I'll show that in a second. When we get to this, we think, well, maybe we're closer to the proper reading direction or transposed version of the plain text. But when you try to solve it, you still get nothing. So it's probably not right yet. But why are the bigrams coming out? Is there something in the encipherment that's making this periodic behavior happen? So here's all the different periods. Here's 19, right?
Oh, okay.
So if we test period 19, we get a huge peak here. And then this is the average that you would see when you shuffle the ciphertext of the 340. You're just scrambling it around and then measuring how many. That's like the control group, right? You look at what you would expect at random. And then you see the 19 is fairly significant compared to that. And there's some other peaks. This is the second highest one at period 5. The third one's at period 39, I believe. So it's interesting, but where do we go from here? I try out different transposition schemes.
You said 39, but it's
Oh,
more like 29.
so this is just the third highest one. This one's at 39. This one's 19.
Oh, I see.
So that's
Okay.
period
I
19.
was looking at the top line.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at. What, oh, no.
Oh, yeah. That's the number of repeats, yeah.
Number 30.
So that's 37.
Okay.
That's 37. There's period 1. When you read it normally, when we only saw 25 repeats, it's right here, slightly above average. But when you get to 19, you get this big peak.
Oh, okay. I see.
That's just for one kind of transposition. We can try another one that has this kind of a simple rule. We can get even more bigrams to come out. I'll get to that. Actually, this is just a comparison with the 408. So the 408, when we run the same test, looking for bigrams at different periods, we get the peak at period 1, which is just reading it normally. You're just reading the text normally. And because that's what the plain text is, it's read normally. A periodic rearrangement of it isn't going to produce more repeating bigrams. And that's why we see it drops off after you get past period 1. There's a way to get even more repeating bigrams to come out using a simple transposition. This one's 2 steps. I call this the period column 2. All it is you're marking all of the odd numbered columns in yellow, all the even ones in orange. Then you put the odd columns in order here, and the even columns in order here.
Oh, I see.
So you have this kind of, you're just uninterleaving the columns and putting them side by side.
Just to see if something shows
Just
up.
to see if something shows up. But that's just the first step. This doesn't by itself produce the extra bigrams.
Yeah, okay.
So you apply another periodic untransposition to it. This one's period 18 instead of 19. So you start here, you count ahead 18 positions to get to here, the plus. Do it again, you get the M all the way down. Start at the top, do the same thing again. You end up with another transposed ciphertext. So now we've got the column period applied, and we've got this linear period applied. And we get this, which has 44 repeats in it. So we've gone from 25 repeats to 37 with this period 19, or if we did this column period 2 and period 18, we have 44 repeats, which is a 75% increase in the number of bigrams, but still no solution. So what does it mean? Why would we have this behavior in the ciphertext if this isn't particularly the correct untransposition of the ciphertext? Is there some other transposition that would resemble this, but this isn't quite there? And we just haven't found it yet? There's some other step? Or it's an even simpler step that we haven't found yet?
If you notice that the pluses are almost all included in the repeats, when you go to that, is the fact that they have so many pluses causing you to see the repeats?
I don't think so, because if you do the random scrambling tests, if they had a tendency to repeat on its own at random, then you would see that in the average. The average is only 20. On the other hand, if you decided, well, I'm not going to limit myself to 2 transposition steps, I'm going to say I can do as many as I want, then it's very easy to put the bigrams back together, because you can do whatever you want, right? You can apply a whole bunch of steps and then you can make them come out. So the fact that these are very few steps and they're very simple make me think that that's not the case, that we're not forcing them to come out. But I'm not 100% sure. You know, it could just be a coincidence. But it's a weird coincidence, right? So I think that's an interesting thing about the 340, this periodic behavior. Maybe it's a clue into the underlying encipherment. All right, let's look at a different pattern. We'll go away from the bigrams. We know that the 408 was a homophonic substitution. So, for example, he had the letter E in his message. He was replacing it with symbols from 7 different...
I think if you could just give a brief definition of homophonic.
Oh, sure.
I think probably not everyone in the room knows what that word means.
Sure. So you know what a regular simple substitution is.
Right.
You just have, like an aristocrat, patristocrat, you just have one. Every letter in English only has one letter assigned to it, right? In a homophonic, you could have more than one letter assigned to it, and you can pick from any of them when you make your substitutions. And that means you can't just count them up and go, oh, this one's the most common letter, so therefore it must be E, it must be standing for E. Mm-hmm. Since there's more than one, you don't know which ones they are, you can't add them up and say, well, these all stand for E.
So you'd have more substitutes for the super common letters and fewer for the, like, J,
Exactly.
K, that kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah. Now there's a pattern that comes out depending on how you encipher that way. So, for example, Zodiac had 7 different symbols that he was using to substitute for the letter E in his message, and that was to hide the frequency of E. So let's highlight them. So here's all the E's in his plain text message, and then this is how he enciphered them. They're all highlighted. He used the Z, this backwards P.
He used it in order, yeah.
Yeah, W plus O dot N and E and so on. And if you write them all out in sequence, you get this. And you can see that there's this repeating sequence frequently occurring as you read along in the cipher, right? So that tells us that when he was making his substitutions, he was going through them in order for the letter E. Every time he came to an E, he would go, what's the next symbol? And he would use that, right? Instead of just picking them at random. And that's why there's this pattern forming. It wasn't perfect. You can see he made some mistakes, like he used E twice in a row. There's an N. Then it kind of breaks down starting here.
Maybe he started to realize what he was doing.
Maybe, yeah. Yeah. He just got tired of it, probably, because you have to track what you're doing. And then so here are the other letters of plain text where he used these kinds of patterns, and you can find them. If you didn't know what the solution was, you could brute force. You could write a program that could brute force and find these, right? And you know, the E is the strongest one because it's so long. There's some other really good ones like this M theta. It repeats perfectly throughout the ciphertext. The substitutes for I, triangle P, U, backwards K. It's a pretty stable pattern for most of the ciphertext.
Until he realizes again what he's doing.
Yeah. And you know, the gray areas are where it kind of breaks down, like it doesn't really fit. But if you didn't know what the key was, you could look for these patterns in the ciphertext. You can just try different combinations of symbols and look for these patterns. And if you found this one, but you didn't know what the solution was, you could just say, well, these all stand for the same letter. Just collapse them all into one single symbol, and then rewrite the ciphertext with that one symbol anywhere where you find any of these. And that makes the problem much simpler to solve. But you know, the Hardens didn't need to do that. They were clever enough to, you know, crack it by hand. So we should look for the same kinds of patterns in the 340. We know he did these cyclic assignments of homophones in the 408. Maybe he did the same thing in the 340. Well, we can look for patterns involving 2 symbols, and here's one that happens perfectly. Backwards L, M, L, M, L, M, L, M, L, M. So it's possible that they stand for the same letter, the same plaintext letter. And there's another example. Upside down V and the half-filled square that repeats perfectly. We can look for patterns that involve more than 2 symbols, and we can find things like this, backwards L, V, M. Seems to follow a similar pattern to the things we saw in the 408, where there was some repetition of the pattern and then it breaks down at the end. But what we find with the 340 is that the cyclic behavior is not nearly as strong as we see in the 408. Anytime we start looking at these sequences that involve more than 2 symbols, there's far fewer of them. And there's more that are just happening by chance, just the random arrangement of symbols in the ciphertext could cause them. But there's still some cycling going on. So either he applied this cycling and then disrupted it somehow, or he didn't use cycling at all, or whatever's disrupting the bigrams in the 340 is also disrupting the cycles here. Go ahead.
How much time was there between when you wrote the 408 and the 340?
He sent the 340 about 3 months after the first cipher had come out. So he had enough time to read the papers and go, oh, that's how the Hardens solved it. Maybe I'll try something different. Pure speculation. So something is causing this cycling behavior in the 340 because it is there to some degree, but it's not nearly as strong as we see in the 408 if you do statistical test. Go ahead.
So do the transpositions that you were showing earlier have any effect on the cyclic patterns?
Not those, but there are others. In fact, there are numerous transpositions that will increase the cycling behavior. But there's so many different ways to increase the cycling behavior. It's hard to distinguish the noise from a real cycling. They don't seem to be related. Bigrams going up with certain transpositions don't seem to correlate with the cycling going up for those.
Okay. You may not know the answer to this, but we see the backward L, and then you see the M's. The LM, 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 it goes in tandem, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Have you, do you see a backward L and then another backward L anywhere before you see the M? Or
no.
Okay, so.
Well, at least, yeah. So, because it appears in a perfect sequence like that.
Mm-hmm. So I've seen examples of ciphers where the L and the M, they sort of like are a shift up and a shift down, where you have 2 different charts that you're working with. So have you examined the cipher like before the backward L and then the cipher after the backward L, separating it into different sections? This comes between the backward L and M, and this part comes between the M and the backward L, to see if you can break into those individually.
I think that's a part of how there's a paper about the strategy I described before, where you identify the sequences and you collapse them into one. There's a paper that came out, I don't know how many decades ago. It was kind of inspired by these researchers trying to break the 340. And they were doing something like that to make an efficient algorithm for detecting where the cycles would start and end. Mm-hmm. And they were doing something like that. They would find every occurrence of the beginning of a cycle, and they would look at the sequence, the symbols that happen in between,
yes,
to conclude whether or not they were part of the same cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And they could like do a process of elimination on that to identify a set of candidate homophones.
Right.
So they did something like that. If you, oh no.
Oh, okay.
Of course not. Yeah, but the people have looked at stuff along those lines.
So if you go back to the other one, the previous, yeah. The last 18 letters were the part that don't really translate.
Yeah,
and
the gibberish.
The breakdown, the worst breakdown, is in that part. So at that point, as you say, he's probably just randomly filling in characters without, if that's what he's doing, then you wouldn't expect that pattern to appear, because he's not even looking at what the values of the characters are.
If you look at the other sequences, a lot of them break down like around here.
Yeah.
So before you get to the filler part. So I looked at that a while back, and it doesn't neatly correlate with just the last 18.
That certainly exacerbates them.
Yeah.
Do they correlate to the third letter sent to that paper? Was it the Times that he sent the third of the 482?
Let's say it was the Chronicle, the Examiner, and the Vallejo Times Herald. Yeah.
So is the breakdown mostly happening in that third letter?
Yeah, it seems to be mostly in the third part of the cipher.
So it could have been done on a different day.
Yeah.
Decided to approach it in a different manner.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. It'd be. I wonder if you could tell from looking at how he wrote the first 2, if there's any difference between, like if he was tired when he did the third one.
Right.
You could maybe see some. And there's some things like that in the 340 where like he would make a plus bigger than the other pluses, or the lines would kind of drift down, as he got further along in the ciphertext. So he was, getting tired or something. All right, so we talked about that. Something is interrupting the cycles in the 340. Another thing we can measure in the ciphertext is the idea of unique sequences, meaning sequences of ciphertext, chunks of ciphertext, where there aren't any repeating symbols, where all the symbols are unique. So, for example, we take this first line of the 408. Well, there's a repeating slash. So this first row is not a unique sequence because it has repeats in it. The rows that have all unique symbols, like this one, where there's no repeating symbols, they're all unique. They're all marked in yellow. So the 408 has 6 such rows with no repeats in them. And this is happening for the 408 because it's a homophonic cipher. And he's assigning the symbols methodically, going through them one at a time, and then going back and repeating them instead of picking them at random, right? So it delays the reuse of a symbol as he's going along. That's why there's longer non-repeating sequences in the ciphertext. That's the explanation for that. The repeating symbols are more spread out because of the homophonic encipherment. Now we see the same behavior happening in the 340 on 9 different rows. And if you do a statistical test, it's very much more significant than what we see in the 408. So this behavior of the symbols spreading out is happening a lot in the 340 for some reason. Maybe because of homophonic encipherment, or maybe because of something else that he's doing. There's another way you can measure the unique sequences, not just on rows, but you can look at unique sequences of any length. So in this measurement, you test all different positions in the ciphertext. This is the 408. You can start at the beginning, and then you keep counting out the ciphertext until you encounter a repeated symbol, right? And then you stop. So you can't go any further because otherwise you would include a duplicate symbol. And so this chunk of cipher has a length of 5. So you get a bucket, you label it 5, add 1 to it, right? That's how we're going to measure these. We're going to go through the cipher, make these buckets representing the different lengths, and count up how many sequences we find. Further along, we get another example. Count from this symbol forward. We get to this duplicate of the backwards Q, right? So we're going to treat this as a unique sequence with a length of 8. So we get a bucket labeled 8, add 1 to it. Keep going. We find an even longer sequence. This one happens to be a length of 34 before we hit the first repeating symbol, this W, right? So we get our bucket labeled 34 and we add 1 to it. Do that for the entire ciphertext, and we end up with this chart. All right. Along the bottom, these are the sequence lengths. So those are the buckets, counting up the number of sequences of each length. The blue hill here, that's just the control group. That's when you scramble the ciphertext and you'd repeat the measurement. This is what you would expect to happen just by chance. These are the counts of unique sequences by length that would happen solely by chance, right? For the 408, we see the hill shifted to the right. So that means there's a lot more longer sequences that have no repeats. And again, that's because of homophonic encipherment with this pattern of assigning symbols. They tend not to repeat, so that spreads them out more, which means in most strings that you look at in the ciphertext, you won't find repeated symbols as often. So that's what we're seeing here. It's a reflection of the homophonic encipherment. This is what the 340 looks like. It has, the control group is a similar kind of distribution, but the 340s, the amount of unique sequences with higher lengths goes up drastically, way out here, peaks, and then suddenly drops off. It doesn't have a smooth drop off. It's like a drastic drop off at a certain length. And this peak is happening with a length of 17. Length of 17. There's like 26 of them. You can find 26 different strings of length 17 that have no repeated symbols in them. Okay, who cares? Well, 17 happens to be the width of the cipher.
Okay.
So it's an interesting coincidence, or maybe there's some connection to the type of encipherment he's doing. Why would the peak be at 17 and happen to be the width of the ciphertext? Unsolved mystery. There's other interesting patterns in the 340. Normally when you look for bigrams and trigrams, you're only looking in one direction. Well, if you look for trigrams in multiple directions, you find these patterns. I call these the pivot patterns because they're repeating trigrams that are joined with some symbol. So they kind of pivot around this symbol. So RJI repeats in two different directions. B.C repeat in two different directions. And they have the same orientation. And if you do a statistical test on this kind of pattern, you find it's pretty rare. So is it intentional? Hard to say.
Those the only two you found? Or?
Yeah, in the 340. There's some others, but they're not as strong. Where is it? You could consider these 3 pluses here, and then these 3 pluses, but they're not the same orientation. And there's so many pluses, there's probably just random noise.
And that's the 408?
Oh, sorry, this is the 340. So this is the unsolved cipher. For some reason, the unsolved cipher has these patterns occurring which tend to not happen at random. Like when you're just... Go ahead.
I was just going to ask if any of the other examples of this have letter shapes. Like this backwards L. They're always in this shape, or?
Yeah, I don't think there are any with other shapes in here that would be this pronounced.
You have to wonder if he's not trying to hide initials in there, or at least a representative of an initial.
Yeah.
Since he says his name's in there, or his identity.
Huh. And people have speculated, well, if there's repeating trigrams, it reflects the plain text, patterns in the plain text. So it's like if it's a crossword, if you wrote it out, the plain text, like a crossword arrangement, that's why you would have maybe common fragments of words joining like this. But, you know, no one's...
This is the 340.
Yeah. So we don't know how it's enciphered, so we don't know what mechanism is causing these patterns to happen, right? So put a pin in this. I'll come back to it. One thing you can do with the 340 is test for polyalphabetism. What if you used a, did a visioneer or something on the plain text and then did a substitution, right? So let's do a key length check using the Kaczynski exam, where you're testing for repeats at certain distances and you look for common factors. Maybe one of those common factors is the key length. One way you can do this is by writing out the original ciphertext, normally here in black, and then a shifted version of it corresponding to the key length you're testing, right, underneath. So this is shifted by 8, so we're testing a key length of 8, or a factor of 8.
Shifted from what?
Well, just shifted to the right. So here's where it starts, like HER greater than, HER greater than. So that's written out, and then it kind of wraps around, the end of it wraps around here. And what we're doing is we're looking for coincidences, where it's repeating. And so they're marked here. So at a shift of 8, we can find 5 repeats, right? 5 coincidences. It's not that many, so key length's probably not 5, if there is a key, if it is polyalphabetic. Fellow ACA member Bart Wenmakers, Bart W., discovered that the peak number of repeats doing this kind of test happens at period 78. So a shift of 78. Like, okay, who cares, right? 78. So we've got like 19 repeats. And they're just single symbols. They're not like patterns like bigrams or trigrams, which you would normally see when you're doing like a Kaczynski exam, and they would give you a lot of evidence that you have the right key length. So it's, I don't know how statistically significant this really is. If you do a random shuffling test, it's like 1 in 100 of them will have this many. So it's not that significant. But I thought the number 78 was interesting. I'll explain why. When we go back to these patterns, this is where it starts to sound like insanity. You can measure the distance between these two patterns.
78?
If you start at the top of the first pattern, you measure the distance to the top of the second pattern, going in a reading direction like this, right, left to right, and then top to bottom, and you count it out, you get 39, which is a factor of 78. Is this madness, or is it there's something to it? I don't know. It sounds like madness, right? These numbers are connected somehow. But wait, there's more. Where did we see 39 before? There. Period 39 was the 3rd highest peak for repeating bigrams. And the reason is, when you do the rule where you skip ahead 39, and you write out the ciphertext, that brings these symbols together. So R, B, J plus dot, they come together, right? And they would come together here too, R, B, J dot. So that's producing more bigrams. It's probably just a coincidence.
Maybe.
Maybe. But the fact that it's interesting that this happens to be the peak for the Kaczynski exam, because these aren't involved in any way with those weird pivot patterns. There's no shared symbols. Well, I guess there's an R there, but that's not the R that was in the pivot. Like, I don't think the pieces of the pivots are involved in these coincidences, you know, between the shifted version of the cipher and the original. So who knows? And this is just the histogram showing, you know, if you test all the different shifts, here's our, you know, shift of 78, you know, we get a pretty big one. The average here is only about 6. So on average, you would only see 6 coincidences.
Is
and
39 that? I can't tell whether the
oh, that's actually 35.
the one.
This one here.
So it's 38 that has that big dip.
Oh,
38, yeah.
Right?
yeah, it's far below the average.
Okay. I couldn't tell whether it's 38 or 39.
Yeah, so I don't know what that tells you. Because there's one here, you know, period 2. I think some other people have pointed out that it's kind of weird that there's so few coincidences at period 2. In a normal cipher, you probably see more because you have repeating bigrams all over the place. I don't know, maybe that would...
So you eliminate those with your homophone, right?
Oh, if you look for those sequences? What do you mean?
Well, you shouldn't get many repeats in 2 if you've got multiple substitutions, right?
That's right, yeah, you wouldn't see them right that close to each other. Yeah, that makes sense. Because it would be a while before you came back to that symbol. All right, more maddening patterns. Here's a maddening pattern. These look kind of cool. They're like little box corners, right? They have the same symbol, and they have these lines coming out. They kind of resemble those pivot patterns, you know, it's like a L shape, different directions. All right, is this significant? I don't know. You could probably make a box corner pattern out of just about any symbol in the, you know, set of symbols in the ciphertext. You could. It's hard to test the significance of this because there's so many possibilities, right? But
Third one in there?
not of those kinds. But there's this one.
Yeah, it looks like that one right there.
Which is an almost. But there's something else that makes it interesting, which is that the O and the C repeat right next to it in each place. Isn't that weird? Coincidence? You know, I don't know. But now, remember the transposition I showed before where we got the most repeated bigrams? If you apply that first step where you're putting all the odd columns first and all the even columns next, it brings them together again.
Wow.
Isn't that weird?
What a fun weird guy. Was he an ACA member?
Yeah. Some people, I think there were stories about that where they would like, hey, give me, the investigators would be like, hey, give me your membership list and we'll you know, narrow down the choices, you know, who lives in California and is the right age and everything. So, strange.
Keep an eye on the time.
Yeah, I'll get to here's the end. So this is the open question, what is this thing? It has a bunch of weird stuff. Some of it seems significant, some of it seems like chasing ghosts. I think there's something periodic going on in what he's enciphered with, because there's the bigrams that seem to be pretty good evidence. But here's some of the possibilities. It's a normal homophonic, we just haven't found the key yet. I think that's unlikely. There's been 50 years of people trying to crack homophonic ciphers, no luck. I think this is the most likely cause, homophonic substitution plus some twist. The twist is done probably before the homophonic encipherment. He did some kind of transposition maybe, some kind of classical scheme, maybe his own homemade thing, which would make it even harder because you don't know what homemade thing he came up with. Or he made a bunch of mistakes. There's a bunch of famous cases of criminals who made mistakes and the codes that they came up with were unrecoverable because of it. Or we all just wasted our time and it was a hoax. He just put a bunch of symbols out there to mess with us for all this time and it was a great success for him. And I'll leave it there. So whatever you guys...
That was cool.
Thank you.
think we need
No,
that.
solve it. Solve the damn thing.
That sounds like a good idea.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, that would be excellent.
Excellent idea.
It's a Cipher font Largo.
Yeah. Oh, that's the guy who came up with it. He made like a true type font based on the Cipher
I was
symbols.
going to ask you if you had your own Zodiac font.
Yeah, yeah.
That's cool.
It's really nice.